that's going to be presenting on it. He is a senior consultant at RSM and out of here in Des Moines. Thank you very much, Dave.
Thanks. All right. So yeah, going to be talking about the PrivExchange attack that came out last month. I'm going to give a high-level kind of technical overview of the attack, talk about how I was able to actually improve on that for use in more offensive operations. It came out as a POC that did require you to kind of have a box on-prem. I thought we could probably make that better. And then talk about how we can actually mitigate that, some of the things that have been released to make this ridiculous attack slightly less ridiculous. Then we'll take any questions. So a little bit about me. My name is Dave Cossa, Twitter, Golden Gun Sec. I'm a senior consultant at RSM, and I'm located in Des Moines. Our office is like, I don't know, a couple miles that way. So the obligatory disclaimer that I always have to give. The information provided in this presentation is for educational purposes only. Please only use this information to test on environments you own or have explicit written consent to test against, smiley face. So, what is PrivExchange? Or as my dad would say, what is a PrivExchange? So basically what it is at a high level, it is a privilege escalation attack that was released by a security researcher, Dirk Jan, last month. Takes advantage of several insecure default configurations related to Exchange that can grant a user additional permissions in Active Directory up to and including the right to DC sync. So DC sync, for those of you that are unaware, basically a process by which you can clone ntds.dit, which is the password database file that stores every user's NTLM hash. So that's always nice to grab. In practice, what this means is that any user with a mailbox can get domain admin level rights on the network. So that's kind of a big jump in privileges there. So what's vulnerable? On-prem deployments of Exchange 2013, 2016, and 2019. So basically anything that most modern corporations are going to be using are vulnerable. This is on-prem only. Office 365 is not vulnerable. But if you do have any on-prem sync servers or communicator servers that are still talking to your O365 deployment, you still will be vulnerable, though. So what's going on with this attack, right? So what is this attack actually taking advantage of? How does it work, you know, kind of on the back end? Really, there's three main vulnerabilities that, when strung together, allow this attack to work, right? So the first is going to be that the Exchange Server Computer object, so the Exchange $ account, has way too many privileges in Active Directory by default. So by default, in Active Directory, the Exchange $ account can do basically anything. It can modify permissions for itself as well as other accounts, which is the biggest one. So as we see here kind of in the pictures on the bottom, we have the Exchange Windows Permission Group, which inherits, which has a member, which is the Exchange Trusted Subsystem Group, and in there, that's where all of your Exchange servers sit. That Exchange Windows Permission Group actually is the group that has most of these ridiculous rights. If you ever dig into ADSI edit and start looking at some of the security tabs and stuff like that, you'll be like, wow, that is a lot of rights on my Exchange account. So the second vulnerability is that there's a feature in Exchange, push subscriptions, that actually cause the Exchange server to attempt to authenticate to a remote system that is provided by the client. So I can send a message that will in turn cause this ridiculously overprivileged Exchange $ account to attempt to authenticate back to me. That's vulnerability number 2 there. And then vulnerability number 3, which I'm sure a lot of you all are aware of, is that NTLM-based authentication is vulnerable to relay attacks if communications are not signed. So, you know, NTLM relay at a high level, we have 3 computers here. You know, we're going to have our connecting computer, we're going to have us in the middle, and we're going to have our target computer. You know, we'll say this is Tim in accounting. So Tim is just going to say, hey, you know, I want to authenticate to whatever, you know, I'm Tim. That is what is known basically as an NTLM type 1 message. I can then take that, and maybe Tim's an admin on some other computer or whatever, wherever I want to go to. I can then turn around and go to my target server and say, hey, you know, I'm Tim. I want to authenticate. And target server says, great, Tim. Here is a nonce. So a nonce is kind of a string of random numbers and letters, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. it's going to send it back and it's going to say, hey, go ahead and hash this with your password hash, with your NTLM hash. That's what's known, that response back, this line back, is what's known as an NTLM type 2 message. So the server sends back, my target server is going to send back that NTLM type 2 to me, the bad guy in the middle, and then I turn right back around to the connecting computer, Tim's computer, and say, okay, Tim, prove to me you are Tim. Here's this nonce, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Go ahead and hash this and then send that back to me, authentic, to prove you are who you say you are. So that's, again, NTLM type 2. Now, Tim, Tim's computer, this is the standard NTLM authentication method. Nothing weird going on here. No pop-up boxes. No, hey, you need to enter your password. This is all done on the back end by Tim's computer. Tim says, okay, great, here's my challenge response hash back. This is if you ever ran Responder or NTM Relay or SMB Relay and you see hashes coming over the wire, what you're seeing is that formatted NTLM type 3 message, that response back. The reason you can't just use that like a standard hash, like an NTLM hash and do pass the hash with it or whatever, is because it's not a true hash. It's a challenge response hash, right? So it's basically that nonce that was taken and then hashed out with the password hash to give this authentication package back, this NTLM type 3 message. So Tim's computer gets this NTLM type 3, gives it back to me. I go around to the server and say, okay, I'm Tim, here you go, here's my NTLM type 3. Server says, great, cool, you're authenticated. And kind of away we go. Now to that server, we are Tim. We can just, tell Tim to go F off and nobody really cares. So that is the third vulnerability. So those 3 vulnerabilities in tandem, or in trio or something, I don't know. Those 3 in summation basically are what allow us to do this PrivExchange attack. So, cool. Now we understand the vulnerabilities on the back end. What is the attack actually doing? So, first step in the attack, what we're doing is we are sending what's known as a push subscription SOAP request to EWS. So Exchange boxes are running EWS on port 443. It is sending a request to the Exchange server that basically says, hey, can you please let me know when a new event occurs on the server? Simple enough, right? I mean, there's push requests, there's pull requests. It is a standard part of the Exchange server API. So if you go on MSDN, this is a completely valid request. It's not really anything out of the ordinary. This is actually how MacMail operates. So it uses these push notifications on the back end. This is an example of that SOAP request that's sent in step 1. So really the cool thing here, and the thing we're taking advantage of, is right here. So right here, we're able to tell the server what URL we want it to connect back to. So we can put that as, wherever we want. We can put that on our attacker box running, NTLM Relay X or whatever. So step 2, cool. Now that we've sent that, step 2, the Exchange server is going to attempt to connect back to the new location that it's pushing notifications to. So we have, the Exchange server. Now it has that push notification subscription. It says, great, I'm going to go ahead and make sure I can actually authenticate to that location I'm supposed to be sending my push notifications to. So what we see here, this screenshot's just showing the server's actually attempting to connect back, right? So we see it's requesting path for PowerPriv. That's just the URI, or I guess the subdirectory that I gave in this example for the Exchange server. So it's actually attempting to authenticate back to my attacker system using this, attacker-supplied URI at that point. So once we have that, we're then going to just do the NTLM relay attack kind of as described, right? So now we're getting that inbound authentication from the Exchange server. We're just relaying that down to the DC and then pushing it back to the Exchange server, sending it to the DC, and now to the DC we are Exchange $, or the Exchange computer account. The interesting thing here that I'd like to point out is that this inbound step 2 is coming in over HTTP. So it's coming in over port 80, and we're relaying back out to the domain controller over LDAP on port 389. That's 2 completely different protocols. Now, the reason that works is because both protocols on the back end are using that same NTLM authentication process. So even though the kind of application layer protocol is different on the back end, they're both using NTLM, so it works very transparently. There are some where it doesn't work as well, like SMB, because there's a slightly different implementation of NTLM going on there. But for HTTP to LDAP, you can do those multi-protocol relays. So from there, we're modifying our privileges, setting up whatever account we want. Since we have access to the Exchange $, account, we're just going to start changing privs. Basically get DA or get DC sync rights on whatever account we currently have access to. So that attack, as is, works great if there's a device that you control on the network that is, already running Linux or a Windows box with Python installed on it. And it's a box you can drop files to and run unsigned binaries on, like app whitelisting or anything like that. And then also, of course, has minimal logging on it. Now, in a perfect world for an attacker, cool, that's awesome. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff. In the real world, that is almost never the case. So there's a lot of hoops you'd have to jump through. It gets way too complicated for me. I don't want to have to deal with all that. So I figured this is a really cool POC. I played with it in my home lab. I'm like, this is super awesome. There's got to be a way to weaponize this, make this more applicable for something I can use for my red teaming stuff that I do in my day-to-day. So I wrote a tool called PowerPriv. So PowerPriv is really kind of trying to come at this from the perspective of a red team assessment, right? So you've gotten a remote shell on an endpoint somewhere. Usually that person's just going to be, again, Tim in accounting. He has no privs. He's just a member of the domain users group. He doesn't have local admin rights anywhere, ideally. The endpoint's pretty locked down. You're not going to really be able to do too much. You probably don't have his plain text creds. Maybe if you opened a link in an email, or open an attachment or something, or you send him a link and he pulls in a file off that web portal. You probably don't have his plain text creds, so you can't necessarily run the attack as is. But let's try and take advantage of the stuff that we do have access to, right? So what we do have right now is the ability to run additional commands as Tim, right? So if I have a shell that's running as Tim, I can spin up a new process. I can run PowerShell. I can run whatever C# app that I want to drop in and do an execute assembly off of or whatever. So this is just a little snippet of the code. So it's whatever use default credentials. So this is just again built-in functionality into the web request class. Very simple. So this gets us around needing to know creds or have an NTLM hash or anything like that the original POC needed. But we still do need to be able to relay somewhere, right? Inve is typically what I use if I'm trying to do any sort of SMB relay attack or whatever, because you can load it into memory. You don't have to have any files touch disk. It's usually pretty clean. However, unfortunately, Inve is pretty light on the multi-protocol relaying, right? I can't do an HTTP to LDAP relay like I could do with NTLM Relay X. It's just not there in Inve. I also don't want to sit down for, however many weeks or months it would take me to try and write that in Inve. So I figured out, we can just use SOX proxying and port forwarding to make this a whole heck of a lot easier. And then finally, so this is PowerPriv. It's a PowerShell script just because, I write a lot of PowerShell scripts and it's easy. I know from an offensive standpoint, obviously a lot of my offensive tooling has moved away from PowerShell into C#, general .NET languages, Iron, Python, whatever. There is also a C# port of this tool that some other dude wrote. He just took my code and converted it to C#. So that is also available as well. So again, if you're trying to use this from an offensive standpoint, I'd probably recommend doing that just because you have less in terms of script block logging and stuff like that. So how does my tool actually kind of add on or make this more usable from an attacker standpoint, right? So overall, the new stuff is not very major, actually. It works very much the same way, right? So we're doing step 1, step 2, whatever. The only different thing that we're doing really is, so we are doing a reverse port forward back to my Cobalt Strike team server. So compromised box is going to basically anything that hits port 80 on the compromised box, instead of getting processed by that endpoint, it's just going to shovel it right back onto my Cobalt Strike team server. It's going to pop up there. So that way, when that authentication comes back from the Exchange server, that NTLM auth, it's not hitting the compromised server. It's just directly getting shoveled all the way back to my team server. Then from there, I'm using a SOX proxy and a tool known as PrivExchange, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, to actually forward the LDAP request back through the compromised system and out to the DC. So that way it kind of takes apart the necessity of having NTLM Relay X on the same system as you're getting the inbound and outbound connections from. So I have a little demo. I'm not going to do a live demo because, not down with that. But I do have a video that I pre-recorded. Let's see if it's running. There we go. Okay. So we have our user Tim. I'm going to come over here so I can actually kind of see what's going on. So we have our user Tim here, and we're just going to say, okay, what groups is he a member of right now? And we can see, cool, Tim is just a member of the domain users group on the domain. So no privs, super low rights, nothing crazy. So next, let's take a look and see what sort of rights he has on his local computer. And we see that he is not a local admin on his system. He's not a member of the local admins group. I wanted to make sure that to do this, you would not necessarily need to be a local admin, because again, that's just another hurdle I'd have to try and jump through. So you don't actually need local admin to carry out this attack. Next thing, I'm going to find the IP of the DC. Obviously, we're going to need the IP of the DC to be able to complete the relay attack, so I just ping the domain name. Next, I'm going to run a little module that I use on engagements to find Exchange servers on the network. Finding Exchange servers sometimes can be kind of a pain, depending on the naming context of the client or of the network. Sometimes like Mail Server 01 or something like that, and it's super easy to find them. Sometimes they have really weird names for servers, and so it's a pain. This just queries AD and actually pulls out, whatever is configured to be an Exchange server. So next, we're going to need that, obviously, so we can know where to shoot our initial SOAP request out to. So what I'm going to do from there is then just pull the IP address and see, cool, we got 192.168.1.106 for the Exchange box. Great. From there, we're going to go see who we need to be targeting, right? So we can always DC sync and just dump the hashes for every single user in the domain. I usually don't do that. I'll usually try and target who I want to go after. It probably is, I don't think there's much of it necessarily a value in doing that in terms of stealth, but, just personal preference, I guess. So from there, we're going to look and set up our proxy. So we've got our proxy chain set up, port 36529. So that's going to be what the port that's getting relayed back out. So we're going to set up a SOX proxy right here on our team server, and what that's going to do is that's going to open up port 36529 on our Cobalt Strike team server and allow us to actually shuttle any traffic that we have destined for port 36529 on our local team server back out through this beacon. Second thing what we're doing here is we're just setting up on that beacon the reverse port forward on port 80, right? So that's going to then take all that traffic from port 80 on the beacon on the remote system and shovel it back to our system on port 80. So now back on our attacker system, we're just setting up NTLM Relay X, which is the tool that you use to actually complete the relay. We're going to do a relay to LDAP on the domain controller 1.2.168.1.105, and we're going to say, hey, escalate privs for Tim, which is our user that we're running as right now that has no privileges. So then we'll actually go ahead and run the tool, and it's just the PowerShell implementation of the PrivExchange thing that we were talking about. When it runs. Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm getting my IP address first. So I probably could have looked at the internal IP. I guess I just forgot or something. But that's going to tell us that when we run, that's going to be the attacker IP. That's going to tell the Exchange server what IP to try and connect back into. So now we're just targeting the Exchange box. We're saying, okay, target is 192.168.1.106 Exchange server. Our box that you need to send the relay back to is 192.168.1.9. Cool. Go ahead and run it. We'll wait a sec for the Exchange server to basically recognize that request. Should see very shortly a big block of text coming back. Okay, so we sent the request. Great. And I will say this is not an instant thing. It takes 30 seconds to a minute to have it actually kick off. But okay, so we did get the 200 back. So 200 says, great, everything's good to go. The target Exchange server should be authenticating shortly. So that means that it basically, we're kind of getting to step 2 in the attack cycle now. We now see on our NTLM relay box that we are getting that inbound authentication from the Exchange server. So we're going through step 2, getting into step 3 now, where we're now forwarding that authentication back out to the domain controller. It's going to sit there and attempt to authenticate. And it said we have successfully authenticated. Awesome. It's going to enumerate Tim's privileges, see if he's already a domain admin, see if he can already do a DC sync. Okay, so it says success. Now it says try using a DC sync with secrets dump and this user. Cool. So luckily, Cobalt Strike, being the awesome C2 agent that it is, actually has DC sync functionality already built into it, so we don't have to use secret steps to try and do that. That way, we, again, still don't know the password. We're just going to try and DC sync and grab the administrator hashes, and there we go. Tim, domain user, now has NTLM hashes for administrator, the domain admin account, and now, for all intents and purposes, I am a domain admin. So that all took about 5 minutes to go from no access whatsoever, just a shell on the network, to domain admin. Didn't need any admin rights, didn't need any passwords, anything crazy like that. So that really is just trying to demo kind of the impact of the attack, how easy it is for an attacker to pull it off. So overall, my initial thought was this is a pretty ridiculous attack vector. This is a pretty high impact vector. How can I protect my organization? So about a week ago, Microsoft did release a patch, which is awesome that they're pretty quick on their feet with this one. They released it in the February 2019 quarterly Exchange updates. And so depending on what version of Exchange you're running, there obviously will be a different patch that you need to apply for that. But that does take care of the majority of the issues. From a logging and monitoring standpoint, watching where the Exchange $sign account is authenticating from. Really there's no reason that Exchange $sign should be authenticating from anywhere other than, the Exchange server. So if you see an Exchange $sign authentication coming from like a random workstation, should be kind of a red flag from a SIM perspective that, something weird is going on there. And then finally, LDAP signing. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of SMB signing. LDAP signing, very similar, basically validating the original sender of a message would be another thing that we'd recommend. Finally, links and references. Nothing really too crazy. The initial blog, my follow-up blog, and then the Microsoft article talking about remediation. So that pretty well wraps everything up. Anyone have any questions on stuff? No? All right, cool. Thanks, guys.